All right, how's it going, guys? I'm gonna do a roughly 1 month review on the Fantech Aria. Um, I suppose it's probably been that long. I don't remember when I got it exactly. I was part of the first round of pre-orders when it showed up on Amazon. I think it was around the start of late August, start of September. Anyway, so yeah, had this mouse for a good while now, got a fair amount of use out of it. It was pretty regularly in rotation with my Outset, and then also a white matte NP01 that I picked up shortly after. Um, and those three mice kind of work together, I suppose, in an interesting fashion, but I'll get to that more later. Um, First off, I wanted to start by describing my grip with the mouse and where I think that outside of the usual sort of claw grippy egg shape type of enthusiasts, there might be another group of people like me who are usually more ergo guys that will find this mouse quite good and quite comfortable. And a lot of that comes back to how much you, how aggressively you dislike having your palm uh, dragging on the mouse pad, essentially. So when I started out um, gaming, it was with, well, originally I had an egg mouse, but the first quote unquote proper gaming mouse that I bought myself was this shape. And the way that I held it was essentially palm grip, except with my ring and pinky fingers slightly curled, not quite touching the side of the mouse there. And the length of the mouse, as you can see, is such that it essentially supported my hand all the way right down here to the base of my palm. And so pretty much the entire length of my hand down to about here, just before the bend where your palm leads into your wrist, was in contact with the mouse, and my index and middle fingers were very relaxed and would drape perfectly along the curvature of the mouse that way. And it felt very natural to click the buttons like this, and it was a very low fatigue grip overall, and pretty suitable for the shape. Again, most people would describe this as essentially being palm grip. The only difference here is the curl on my ring and pinky fingers not quite resting flush against the side of the mouse. And a lot of that just had to do with the fact that for my hand width and preferred finger position, I never really liked having my pinky kind of knuckle drooped down so that I could push the finger kind of up and forward like this to rest it along the side of the mouse. Um, so essentially, the right side of this mouse was slightly too low for me to really rest my pinky flush against the side of the mouse, even though the shape would accommodate it. So that was my initial grip. Um, and it worked pretty well. Over the years, I transitioned off to using 518. I've talked about all this before, probably, so I won't spend too long on that. And I went with, slightly more of a relaxed claw grip, because even though I could rest most of my fingers, index and middle fingers, cleanly on the top of the mouse, the overall curvature of it was slightly awkward to do that. And the way that the front of my fingers wanted to curl down to be able to have the pads of my fingers pushing firmly on the buttons meant that to accommodate that, the back of my fingers would get picked up slightly like this and would lose contact. So I went from more of a palm grip to more of a relaxed claw. Anyway, to bring that all back, I started using the Outset, as you've seen in a variety of videos, and originally I gripped that mouse more like this, and essentially what I was doing was attempting to imitate the feel of a mouse like this in terms of how it touches back here in my palm, but using this shorter shape, so it got pulled further into the base of my hand, and the way that the back corners of the hump here are quite pronounced on the Outset meant that it started aggressively pushing the meat of my palm apart here. And so I always felt like I was squeezing against the shape of the mouse and really kind of pinching it between these 2 points here. And it created a lot of kind of like it created a lot of control and like confidence in my command over the mouse because of how much pressure I could apply to it. But I really did need the grip tape on it to be able to pull the mouse into the base of my palm firmly enough to accommodate that grip. So when I got the Aria, initially I tried holding it like that. I tried pulling it more into the base of my palm and using it this way, and it ended up with my ring and pinky fingers pushed quite forward towards the front of the mouse. And the other thing that you really notice with the shape, I find, is it doesn't want to line up straight with your wrist and your forearm if you hold it this way. To me, based on the way my hand is shaped, if I try to pull a thin tapered mouse into my palm, it wants to sit at a rotated angle, where essentially the mouse is kind of cocked over to the side this direction. And I can adjust my wrist motion to compensate for that and keep my horizontal swipes with wrist aim lined up evenly. But then that means I have to actively use my wrist motion while arm swiping to prevent my horizontal tracking from being thrown off as well. And you could argue that it would be workable to use the rotation tool in raw Excel to compensate for this, of course. But I always struggle with that because I find that the required motion to compensate for just wrist aim versus arm and wrist aim together is slightly different. And I felt that it would have taken me a long time to rebuild my sense of what was going to work intuitively while trying to aim that way if I used the rotation tool. Plus, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to do that unless this was going to be the only mouse that I used. Because other mice, like the Outset, I can hold in my grip naturally in a way where the sensor does line up with my forearm evenly. And so it wouldn't have made sense to then have to change my grip on the Outset to get a similar rotation. And it also wouldn't have made sense to have different rotation values, which would have meant the way my arm and wrist work together would have had to be unique for different mice in my collection. So it seemed like if I was going to use the Aria that way, it wouldn't have fit in very well. And so I said, okay, what else would be potentially workable? And that's where essentially what I did with this mouse is I took the kind of grip I originally used here, right? And I said, you know what? What if I do this, but instead of pulling a shorter mouse into the base of my hand, I just leave the front of my hand where it is. And so that's how I grip the Aria. If I take my hand off the IntelliMouse, plop it on here so that the front of the mouse is in roughly the same spot. Now the front of the mouse sits up here, braced under my first two knuckles. And I get enough support to the underside of my hand that I don't feel like my hand is too flat or pancaked out like this, forcing my fingers to curl back awkwardly. The way the front of the mouse slopes down is correct, like the IntelliMouse, to allow a nice, gentle finger curl with smooth contact all the way down and get firm pressure with the pads of my fingers on the mouse to actuate the buttons. So again, it's a very sort of low stress or low fatigue grip. And then my thumb placement sits slightly further back than might be ideal for actuating the thumb buttons on this mouse, certainly, but right in the thumb groove. And it's far enough back that I can pinch the mouse between my ring finger and thumb and get good control over the shape and create a lot of stability, especially when you account for contact between my ring and pinky knuckles with the rear right of the mouse. So I get a very solid contact triangle here that gives me very good rotational and longitudinal sort of translational control over the shape, despite the fact that essentially my whole palm back here is just empty. It's not even pushing into the center of my palm here. It only really contacts this kind of upper region here by these two knuckles and then gets braced on the side against here. And with that tapered corner, it fits very well into that. And the upside of this as well is that I have a lot of downward range of motion if I want it without changing my grip. And aiming downward was always a weakness that I struggled with. So any grip that increases my downward range of motion effectively, as this does, is quite a large potential upside for my aim. So overall, given that the width towards the front of the mouse here, similar to where I was gripping the IntelliMouse here, is sufficiently wide enough to accommodate my hand comfortably, I said, this is actually working quite well. Can I do this with my other mice? And it turns out that yes, actually I can. I can adopt essentially a very similar grip with the Outset, and this mouse feels actually to me like it was intended more for this type of grip than a more traditional kind of relaxed claw. And the reason I say that is because when I hold it this way, you see how this flare on the thumb side perfectly fills up all the space here where my thumb wants to curl. And then actually it's far enough forward in my hand that these protruding areas in the back corners are no longer trying to force the base of my palm down here outward. And so not only do I have a ton of control over this rear corner, I still have very firm contact in this area, and I still have the grip tape allowing me to control the front right corner of the mouse securely. So I have similar level of control and stability with this mouse that I got with the Aria. Again, unfortunately, like the IntelliMouse, the right side of the Outset is a little bit too low for me to really be able to use my pinky comfortably with a flush grip on the side the way that I want to. So if I were to do that, you can see it would hang down below the height of the mouse, and so I end up having to curl it slightly, and that creates some gap there in order to use it in that grip. But I am able to get some similar level of downward range of motion with the Outset here that wouldn't have been possible with my old grip. And so overall, those two mice have worked extremely well holding them that way. To link into this as well, I always struggled with the NP01 because it was quite a flat mouse across the top, and my natural inclination is to use a slight tilt to my wrist. So whenever I used this mouse before with this kind of a grip, more of a traditional relaxed claw, it always frustrated me because it felt very secure and I had very good stability and control over it. But my index knuckle and to some extent my middle knuckle weren't really supported by the hump of the mouse at all. They're just kind of floating there. And so it got quite annoying and fatiguing to use, to have to essentially hold this part of my hand upward to maintain a comfortable grip constantly. And if I tried to lower them down onto the mouse, then it essentially tried to kind of fold my palm around this point too aggressively to really be comfortable, and this outside corner of the hump here really started to irritate me. So if I push the mouse further forward into my grip, what happens is actually these last two knuckles, instead of sitting up here on the hump, they slide further back, and that means they sit lower over here and on a more aggressively rounded part of the hump. And what that means is I'm actually able to use a low wrist tilt angle that I prefer and use it in a way that actually is getting me support for these two knuckles now. So not only is it more comfortable, but again, because it's pushed forward, I have similar fitment here in the curve of my thumb. And also, it creates a little bit of a wider area here by pushing the mouse forward. Instead of my pinky gripping in this area directly across from my thumb, it grips back here where the mouse is wider, and that's more helpful in accommodating my pinky finger. Normally, I struggled with the MP01 as well because it was so low overall that I felt like it was limiting in terms of space for my ring and pinky fingers. And it still feels a little bit like that, but it's significantly better with this more kind of backed off of the mouse grip. As you can imagine, and as I described earlier in the video, the main difference here is that now you can see the whole back end of my hand is basically just dragging on the pad, right? And so a lot of whether or not this is a viable grip style for you comes down to, like I said, that degree of preference. How much do you dislike that sensation of your palm dragging on the pad? In this particular case, with this pad, since I've used the absolute heck out of it over like 6 or 7 months, and it really got worn down, it's super sensitive to sweat and humidity now, unfortunately, and so I absolutely have to wear a sleeve in order to get any kind of consistent glide on this surface, which is why I don't really use it that much anymore. But for example, even on the GameSense Radar or pads like the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn, I had no issue using this grip without a sleeve. So to me, it's quite a good solution in that it allows me to keep this sort of very low fatigue, relaxed grip that I enjoy about mice like the IE 3.0 shape. And I'm able to accommodate that grip to the current trend of shorter and smaller mice in a way which not only retains this level of comfort and quite a relaxed straight wrist angle as well, but also creates extra downward range of motion to help address one of the consistent weaknesses that was present in my gameplay. So yeah, I know that's a lot more than just talking about the Aria, but I figured I would get that out of the way. I'll try to do a little bit more in depth in a separate video with the NP01, but let's move on to the rest of the review for the Aria. So other than the shape, which overall, in conclusion, I'm quite fond of, I think they did a very good job of it. This angle of curvature here, as mentioned, for me is perfect for getting my fingers to rest naturally on top of it in a very comfortable way. And the contact angle between the pads of my fingers and the main buttons is ideal. The placement of the thumb buttons, given my preference for the size and shape of the mouse, they are slightly farther forward than I would like to see them, but overall they're still usable. I am currently hitting mouse 5 without actuating mouse 4. What it requires me to do is curl my thumb and then kind of roll it up like this. And it's a little bit questionable. I'm not as confident in hitting just the front thumb button all the time, so I don't use it that often. And that was one of the compromises I made when I switched to this grip, is I said, okay, I know that this grip will limit access to thumb buttons, so I'm going to transition my playstyle away from utilizing those as often. And now I use my rear thumb button for push to talk, and then I'll use my front thumb button for useful or important in-game keybinds, but only ones that are lower in terms of time-sensitive nature. They're pre-planned, premeditated actions that don't need to happen in the middle of a fight. And so that's how I assign them now to compensate for this adjusted grip style. Anyway, but overall, I like the buttons. The KLs on the main clicks are not overly stiff. They don't sound particularly cheap or hollow, although they are not the nicest GM8s I've ever heard, but they're nowhere near as bad as something like the Origin 1X's right click was on all the out-of-the-box copies I tried. So certainly they're above average in that sense. The thumb buttons feel quite good, which makes sense to me. They're Huano's relatively firm white dot, and I know that I like that switch. So yeah, I mean, that's the same, essentially, slightly lower lifespan variant of the same switch that I put in my MX518 for its thumb buttons and have been very happy with. So yeah, no complaints there. Similar scroll click, light enough that I don't have issues with accidentally scrolling while actuating it. And I really like the TTC Gold encoder. The steps are clearly defined at low speed like this, but they're not overly aggressive. But it also has this other benefit over every encoder I've tried, including the Alps encoder, where scrolling quickly, you don't lose as much in terms of the clarity of each step's tactile feedback. So they can blend together a little bit, but I still feel like on this type of a scroll, I feel each one of those individual steps a lot more clearly than I do on every other encoder I've tried. And so if I were trying to play a game where where inputting a large number but a specific number of scroll steps was important, I would not want to use anything other than a TTC Gold for that, honestly. Maybe the one on the EC1C, the updated optical encoder on the new Zowie mice, particularly the ones on the EC1Cs that I've had were good, but I don't think that they were to this level in terms of tracking 3, 4, 5 step scrolls clearly just based on tactile feedback. So that's really nice. And the fact that I know it's a relatively durable encoder and seems to have a good track record so far is also a big positive. Let's see, what else? The shape, I really like the width. I really like the length overall. Given that it's an egg shape, I think this is about right. Combined with the width, I wouldn't have minded seeing a version or a variant without this thumb divot. I don't find it to be particularly important to me. Other ideas would have been to have also a variant that was perhaps slightly wider back here, a little bit more reminiscent of the G303 shape, where it's more diamond with a longer top and a shorter back. That would give you a little bit more aggressive of a surface to pull back into your hand with your pinky in particular, because when I grip this mouse, sometimes my pinky placement slips down into this area, and I don't feel like I have a whole lot of traction to pull the mouse backwards with it. I can still push the mouse to the side or lift it just fine, but I don't feel like I'm able to kind of pull it down with my pinky when it curls to this length. And I know that it includes grip tape in the pack, and I could have applied that, or I could have cut some DIY BTL grip tapes to address this. But just comparing it to my experience with the G303 for reference, I do prefer essentially the right side of that mouse a little bit for that particular reason. But I appreciate the relative amount of incline here, the way that it gets slightly wider towards the top but not excessively. I think that's judged about right. And the amount of height that's left here for ring finger placement towards the front of the mouse is good. It's enough for me to be comfortable. And the way that the button is designed, the right mouse click hardly touches my ring finger at all, and certainly does not drag on it in any way that would cause irritation or discomfort with extended use. So despite the fact that they cut the buttons here all the way out pretty much to the side of the shell, they did it about as well as you can for this particular design. Personally, I don't think the right mouse button needs to be this wide, especially not when you're creating a comfort curve here and then leaving a pronounced kind of ridge right there. It's like, why not just flip up the edge of the button, leave it there, and then extend this out as a wall, extend the side of the mouse as a vertical wall, and hold the button inside it. That makes a lot more sense to me, but whatever, I'm not a product designer that works at a real company, and I'm not getting any feedback from factories or doing any testing on those designs. That's just my personal preference. What else? Oh, yeah, okay, so biggest gripe with the mouse, honestly, is this removable rear shell. I know they wanted to give you a way to store the dongle. I appreciate that. And also, I know that based on what you can see from the design here, they might have had difficulty finding space to, say, move these buttons slightly higher up. That's where I wish they would be, is right here, and that they would be right there so that this space here could have a bottom entry slot for the dongle to be inserted in this region, rather than where this power button is, rather than from the top here. And that way you wouldn't have this magnetic cover, because unfortunately, especially as you can hear, if you're somebody who puts a lot of pressure on this back right corner of the mouse, you will get lots of noises from it. Thankfully, with this particular grip I'm using, I'm only pushing downward right here. And as you can see, I'm actually deforming the mouse pad, and I'm not getting any real creaking or issues in terms of structural strength right there. So another way in which my particular grip I adopted happens to work well for this particular mouse, but overall, I don't know. I just think this removable rear cover is kind of a gimmick. And the amount of weight added by having these magnets and screws in there, yeah, I mean, they could have repurposed that to attach these buttons here instead of using these two plastic clips that you can see protruding down here. They could have used screws to secure that and made it easier to properly disassemble and reassemble. And that would have been a better design for people like me who might want to fix the mouse, for example, because, and again, a number of these copies have had issues with the Kales double clicking out of the box. I haven't been able to confirm anything in terms of electrically driven double clicks, i.e. I can't determine that there's a debounce issue in the switch itself that is causing these problems. About the only way that I would have of reliably testing that would be to replace them with something like a 68 grams force Huano Blue Shell Pink Dot that I know has gold coating and has plenty of rebound force. Those are the same switches I use in here for reference. And I never have issues with accidentally kind of double clicking due to like a muscle spasm or a contraction. I will do that with the stock Vaxi switches, and I'll accidentally click on the MP01 occasionally. But anyway, so they might just be KLGM8s, which are spec'd to be a little bit too lightweight and not quite stiff enough to prevent kind of, yeah, like a physical or a mechanical input double click, where, you know, you as the user are the one kind of triggering it instead of it being an electrical issue, or like a buildup of corrosion problem. Essentially, they might have spec'd it such that the leaf spring is so weak that it doesn't resist that type of small input that well. I don't know. I hope it's just a software thing that they can address with a firmware update and not have to add a bunch of click latency to the mouse. But we'll see. What else? Overall, I actually do like the size of these thumb buttons and the shape. They have a nice lip along the bottom here, and they protrude far enough that I can firmly feel them and actuate them by just rolling up and pushing on the bottom of the button here. Like I'm just pushing upward, and it actuates very reasonably. Like I don't have to push harder than if I'm pushing this way. So very good side button design overall. I just wish they were moved slightly further back. That would have been my preference. But I know, like, if I'm gripping the mouse this way, like most people would, now I'm feeling like the side buttons are slightly too far back. So overall, this is probably the best compromise. And yeah, I'm just being super picky about what I would have wanted for my particular grip style. I think that's it, honestly. I think overall the shape is really well done. I think the buttons are really well done outside of the double clicking issue. The scroll wheel is excellent. And I just wish they were able to find a way to change the design to accommodate a bottom mount dongle storage that uses like a magnet or is more like the friction fit one in the GameSense MVP, because there's no issues with the dongle falling out of that mouse. And if they had been able to do that and design it so that it didn't have this removable rear shell, then it would have been lighter, and it would have been slightly better build quality, and you wouldn't have had these issues with it creaking. So that would be my primary feedback going forward for Fantech. They've tried this on the XD5, and again, it was similar kind of problems. They tried it again on the Aria. It just doesn't really seem to add value to the mouse, in my opinion. Like they originally they said it was so people can easily 3D print different shapes for it. And like I understand what they're saying, but they saw that nobody actually really did that, or at least I've not seen any evidence of people actually 3D printing different rear shells for their mice. And potentially it's just because they weren't mainstream enough, but as long as they keep having issues with creaking on the stock shell, and if they keep having issues with double clicking on the switches going forward, then I don't know that they'll get to be mainstream enough that people will bother printing out different shaped back covers for their mice. So, I mean, yeah, I could print out a different back cover for a Logitech G703 if I wanted to, because it attaches with 5 screws inside the mouse and is a separate shell piece that's removable, right? So you could just print out a different one with those 5 threaded holes or standoffs inside it and mount that on the shell and do the same thing without using magnets and inducing creaking in the mouse. It's just, anyway, I'm ranting. I'll stop. But overall, like I said, I think the shape is great. The buttons are great. If you don't get too troubled by the occasional double click for now. And I don't have any issues with accidentally clicking these when I don't mean to. It's a similar thing that I find with the IntelliMouse shape. If I'm able to get proper curve support here along the back half of my finger on the first joint there, I almost never accidentally click the buttons when I don't mean to, because there's just not enough weight pressing down on the front of the switch due to the weight of my fingers. And that's essentially one of the differences with MP01 design, right? I can't get my fingers to sit totally flush on the top as easily, and so they tend to curl up a little bit like they did on the 518. There's a little bit of a gap there, and they're just more likely to induce accidental clicks. So yeah, overall, a very good mouse, extremely good value at $70. Don't overpay for them. Wait for them to restock on Amazon so you can get one with free returns and try it without committing your money to something and then getting frustrated at it. Like, I get the whole, ooh, Bezos, Amazon bad thing, but like, I don't know. I've been so burned by so many launches of mice this last year that have issues on launch, like the 731, all of its problems with latency, and the X2 with the double clicking copies out the factory, and all this other crap that we've seen. It's just like, stop buying pre-orders, stop buying directly from company sites with no guarantee of a return policy. It's just, you're essentially saying, oh, we don't care about accountability or holding manufacturers up to the standard of delivering a good product on a first round. It's like, yeah, just use us all as your test guinea pigs and then ship us something that has problems and then fix it later. Like, I don't think that's a culture of business that we want to be encouraging as a community. So anyway, yeah, I'd say wait till they restock on Amazon, but that's just me. Hopefully that was helpful. I know that was like way too much background context for the shape probably, but I wanted to explain the whole thought process, why I hold it the way I do, and why I think it works. Like I've said before, it certainly accommodates more of a traditional claw grip. And the great part about egg shapes is that they don't push against and interfere with these muscle groups at the base of your hand too much. But it still doesn't quite like to sit straight in my hand, not unless I push it further forward like this, and then I end back up at the grip that I actually use. So anyway, that's pretty much it, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next video with the NB01.